Will the audience please rise for the arrival of the official party? Seats. Good evening and welcome General McKenzie, Rear Admiral Spicer, Rear Admiral Day, Rear Admiral Johnston, Coast Guard Academy faculty and staff, distinguished guests, and of course, fellow members of the Corps of Cadets. Thank you all, both here in Leamy Hall and those joining online for this special evening. I am Cadet First Class Mary Murgott, the Regimental Commander. I am excited to welcome you all to tonight's event, a conversation with General Frank McKenzie, presented by the U.S. Naval Institute with generous support from the William M. Wood Foundation. Moderating the discussion is retired U.S. Navy Captain Bill Hamblett. Captain Hamblett is the Executive Vice President for Periodicals, Membership, and Marketing at the U.S. Naval Institute and Editor-in-Chief of Proceedings. General McKenzie has commanded at the platoon, company, battalion, Marine Expeditionary Unit, and component levels. As commander of U.S. Central Command, he oversaw some of the most important and controversial operations in modern U.S. military history. General McKenzie had direct operational responsibility for the strikes on Qasem Soleimani and two successive leaders of ISIS, the many months of deterrence operations against Iran and its proxies, and the methodical drawdown in Iraq. He directed the non-combatant evacuation operation in Afghanistan and the United States' final withdrawal from the tortured country. General McKenzie retired in 2022 as the 14th commander of Central Command, completing a 42-year career as a Marine. Before Central Command, he served as director of the Joint Staff. He is currently the executive director of the Global and National Security Institute and the Florida Center for Cybersecurity at the University of South Florida. General McKenzie's book, titled The Melting Pot, High Command and War in the 21st Century, was released in June by the U.S. Naval Institute Press and details his 3 years as commander of U.S. Central Command. Now over to you, Captain Hamblett.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be back here. My first time here at the at the Coast Guard Academy, and I won't live that one down. So I was here in 2021 when the first class were fourth class cadets for your leadership conference, and I was talking to General McKenzie last week about this, and I said, sir, if you've never been to the Coast Guard Academy, you're in for a treat because it is small but mighty with a tremendous amount of energy. And so I really look forward to this conversation tonight. It's always a pleasure for me as the editor-in-chief of Proceedings to interview a Proceedings author or Naval Institute Press author. And General McKenzie is both, and his book, The Melting Point, Leadership, High Command, and War in the 21st Century, we published earlier this year. I interviewed him about the book a few months ago on our Proceedings podcast. And we're just going to touch on a few things in there because I know most of you haven't had the chance to read the book. But my job tonight is really just to start the conversation, get him to talk a little bit about the book and some of the major points in it. And then that will stir your questions and your minds. The best part of the conversation is always the conversation between cadets or midshipmen and the guest of honor. So with that said, let's get to it. So General, there are three main themes in your book. So the first one is the primacy of civilian control of the military. The second one is the uniqueness of being a theater combatant commander. And the third one is that leaders do matter. We're less than a week from the presidential election. Talk a bit about the importance of civilian control of the military and the importance of a nonpartisan military.
First of all, I'm delighted to be with you here tonight. I've never been to the Coast Guard Academy before, never been to New London before. I have worked with a lot of Coast Guard people in a long career, and I've had direct operational control of Coast Guard forces as the Central Command commander, particularly those Coast Guard elements that are based out of Manama, Bahrain. So I have a very high regard for the Coast Guard's capabilities. And I've also had a lot of individual Coast Guard people work for me on various staffs. I was delighted at the opportunity to come here tonight. It meant a lot to me to actually come see the product being made, spend a little bit of time with it. So one of the things that I think is unique about the United States is the fact that our military is completely subordinated to civilian control. That's not true in much of the rest of the world. We all know that the commissioning oath to the Constitution. It's not an oath person. And, I've taken that oath. I took it about 12 or 13 times as I was promoted and went to different jobs throughout my career. Every time I took it, I thought about it. In the second half of my career, as I administered it a lot, made sure the person I was giving it to, the people I was giving it to, took a moment to think about it as well. That is unique. Our relationship to the Constitution is a unique thing. It's vital that decisions in this country need to be made by elected, appointed, constitutionally appointed civilian leaders. I functioned at a very high level as a combatant commander. Worked for two people. I worked for the President of the United States. I worked for the Secretary. I didn't work for anybody else. Didn't work for the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Didn't work for the Joint Chiefs themselves. Didn't work for Congress. I worked for just two people. That puts you in the room with the President and his advisors when decisions are being made. So I had the opportunity to participate in those discussions. And what just drove home a point for me in my 3 years at Central Command, something I'd sort of had a gut feeling about for most of my career. I got to see it up close and personal. The Republic works as long as the military is a junior silent partner in the way we govern ourselves and in the way it carries out the orders of authority. More practically, and I'll make a little point about it, any president, Republican, Democrat, has the right to make a bad decision, has the right to make a wrong decision, has a right to make a decision that is morally repugnant. But if the order is legal, that president has every expectation that those orders are going to be carried out. In fact, the Uniform Code of Military Justice is pretty clear on this. If the order is legal, you got to do it. You can disagree with it on religious reasons. You might disagree with it for a variety of things. Particularly if you're a 4-star officer, you got to execute those orders. When I was the Central Command commander, I had 14 lawyers that surrounded me down in Tampa, and they were happy to tell me what an illegal order was. But I actually knew what an illegal order was. 42 years, 10 months of service, I never received an illegal order. I knew what one would look like, and you all know what an illegal order would be. So, but that's a very important thing. Any president, any civilian leader should be able to give an order that's wrong, and there's a place to debate that. I have debated. I have given advice to presidents, and sometimes my advice was taken, sometimes it wasn't. But when it's all said and done, military is the junior partner. I'll just cite one kind of a neat historic example of this. In April 1945, FDR dies down at Warm Springs, Georgia. Harry Truman, the vice president, is actually hiding out in the basement of the Senate having a drink with some other senators. They call him over to the White House, and very quickly they administer the oath to him. Nobody wonders where George Marshall is, the nation's senior military officer. In fact, Truman writes later in his biography, he looks around the room, there's only 2 uniforms in the whole room where they're swearing in the new president, and they were junior people. And you know what? That's exactly right. That's not the military's business. Military's business in this republic is to follow orders as long as they're legal. And so I would just close that comment by saying it's very important that the military remain apolitical. Again, in all my decades of service, except with very, very close personal friends, people that I've known for 30 years or more, I never had any political discussions with anybody, not in a work environment. It just wasn't something that came up. I think that's another very important thing that we need to think about. You're entering a time now where a lot of these things are under discussion broadly in all kinds of media. It's a little bit different than when I was commissioned in 1979. On the other hand, there's a thing called historical presentism. The idea that things right now are different than they've been at any time in the past. Actually, that's not true. Politics in this country and the military's involvement in it, we've been in bad places before. Right after World War I, when Woodrow Wilson came back to try to get the League of Nations through the Senate and was unsuccessful in doing that. Other times have also been bad, poisonous times in American politics, and the military tried with varying degrees of success to stay out of that. So this is not a new thing. I think it's going to be challenging for you as you graduate in the years ahead. We can follow up on that in the period.
All right. So General McKenzie was the commander of CENTCOM at a pivotal time, 2019 to 2022. worked for two different commanders-in-chief, and also at a time when some major decisions were made about U.S. involvement in the Middle East, including finishing off the leader of ISIS, the decision to take out the head of the Iranian Quds Force, Qasem Soleimani, which was a precision drone strike while he was in Iraq, in fact, and then the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan. In your book, you describe all of those things and those decisions, and the process was really very involved. And you describe in your book that the position of being a combatant commander, a theater combatant commander, is a unique position in the U.S. military. So talk a little bit about how that is unique. What were some of the very difficult decisions, and perhaps maybe some of the most fascinating aspects of that very unique position in our military?
So there are 11 combatant commanders. You all know that. 4 are functional combatant commanders: space, cyber, transportation, special operations. The remaining 7 are 4-star generals and admirals, men and women, who have responsibility for a part of the Earth's geography. Every part of the Earth has some U.S. combatant commander that's responsible for it. That's responsible for U.S. military activities in that region. My responsibilities were for CENTCOM: Egypt in the west, Pakistan in the east, Kazakhstan in the north, to Yemen in the south. 21 countries, and in 2021, we brought Israel in from European Command to make it 21. 3 of the world's major choke points are there: Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb, and the Suez Canal. The world's religions come together there. There are ancient enmities there. And so CENTCOM was a unique, turbulent, and violent place while I was in command. So I'll go back and build on something I talked a little bit about in my first comment. As a combatant commander, you work just really for 2 people. The chain of command is very clear. Chairman is the senior military officer of the United States by law, custom, and tradition. It's a good friend of mine now, an Air Force guy named C.Q. Brown. He's a close personal friend. But CQ is an advisor. He's not in the chain of command. He cannot cause a ship to sail. He cannot cause an airplane to take off. He can't cause an infantry battalion to march. He gives advice. That's all he does. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, my service chief, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, the Chief of Naval Operations, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, they are advisors. And not only are they advisors, they recruit the force, they train the force, they equip the force, they think about what the future of the force should be, but then they present the force to combatant commanders, and we consume the force. We take the force and we employ it. Only combatant commanders do that. So what's unique is chiefs, the chairman, give advice to senior leaders, the president, the cabinet, other people, the National Security Council. But when it's all said and done and the decision's made, they're not responsible for execution. Combatant commanders in the room too. I was typically in the room for most decisions that were made about Central Command with 2 presidents at different times. Had the opportunity to give advice. You're a junior partner in that dialogue. A really smart observer, a guy named Elliot Cohen, who's at the Brookings Institute, wrote a book about it, and he talks about you're a junior partner in that relationship, and properly so, but you do get, your voice is going to be heard. Then when it's finished, you walk out of that room and you're going to get an order to execute it. So only the combatant commander stands astride that boundary. So at the very top, in the place where presidents make decisions, you're talking about a place that's a nexus of policy, practical statecraft, and politics. Any U.S. president is going to consider politics as he makes decisions. To believe that's not the case is to be naive. It didn't start in the last 20 years. It goes back many years. It goes back to the time of Abraham Lincoln during the American Civil War and other incidents since then. So presidents have to take that political calculation on board because they occupy a unique place. When I had input into decisions in CENTCOM, I saw the 21 countries I was responsible for. Because I've been lucky enough to be the director of the Joint Staff before, I also had a pretty good picture of the globe and knew what else was happening around the world. But when it's all said and done, my moral responsibility was to the men and women that worked under my command inside U.S. Central Command. So I could not see the whole world. Only the president and his advisors and the chairman can see the whole world. So their perspective must necessarily be different. And I might think something's too high a cost to pay for something. from the perspective of the president, that might be a reasonable, prudent risk to do. So I'll cite one example of that. In the fall of 2019, we were going back and forth with Iran over maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration was going on. Iran was a little bit in the corner, and they thought they needed to get out of that. And they were going to get out of it by attacking us and trying to reset the balance in the region. As we got into December, attacks on our embassy in Baghdad was imminent. In fact, you may have seen some of those images of people rushing the embassy, never in danger of falling, but people remember Benghazi, and it has a powerful effect on decision makers in Washington. So great risk of attacks going on. So Qasem Soleimani, commander of the Quds Force, about my age, born in 1956, 1957, charismatic leader. I've studied that guy for a long time. I know a lot about it. And but he was the guy that made things happen in Iran. He could fly into Iraq. He could knock heads, get all the Shia militant groups together. And in late December 2019, it was clear to us from intelligence that I can't share with you that he was definitely going to go into Iraq, and he was going to make attacks happen on our embassy and probably on other embassies. At that point, the recommendation was the risk of inaction is greater than the risk of action. We need to remove him because he was a unique link in the Iranian system. Because the way that I've always been brought up, the way the U.S. military runs, there are no people greater than the institution. That's one of the compelling things about the U.S. military. Arlington Cemetery is full of indispensable men. So, you know, if you can't if you got to leave, they'll find somebody else to do the job. But in Iran, he was close to indispensable. He had a familial relationship with the supreme leader, Khomeini. He could step outside the Iranian military chain of command to give advice, and he could make things happen in a way that really nobody else could. So it was my judgment that if we allowed him to go in and do this in Iraq, Americans would die. So my recommendation was we needed to strike him. I was also open-eyed about what that would mean. The Iranians would want to hit back at us. I was concerned about what that would be. So one of the things you do as a central command commander, you fight for resources all the time. You fight for destroyers, you fight for carriers, you fight for submarines, you fight for ballistic missile defense platforms. You fight for all, that's one of the big things that a combatant commander does. I'm negotiating about this. At the same time, I'm recommending we strike him. But I did recommend we strike him, and I think President Trump made that decision. That's the time I was actually not in the room for that decision. I was at my headquarters in Tampa because things were going on in the region, and I had to manage the fight from there. And the decision was actually made at Mar-a-Lago with then Secretary Esper and General Milley in the room. They transmitted the decision to me, and we struck him a couple of nights later as he got off his airplane in Baghdad. And he got on a road that, for those of you that have, and I know not many in this room have actually, because you're so young, don't remember the way we used to name all the roads in Iraq had code names. Like the big road from Kuwait up to Baghdad was Route Tampa. But the road from the Baghdad airport to downtown Baghdad was called Route Irish. And I would say 300 U.S. Marines and soldiers died on Route Irish as the direct result of Qasem Soleimani's actions. He introduced explosively formed penetrators into the fight. A lot of blood was shed on Route Irish at the hands of Qasem Soleimani. So we struck him on Route Irish because it's the only road out of the airport. Collaterals were real low. There were no other people around. And I got some measure of closure, at least that for me, that we got him on Route Irish. It was a difficult decision to recommend. It wasn't my decision to make. It was the president's decision to make. But it was the recommendation that we had. It was an opportunity, and that is sort of an example of the way these things can happen. These decisions can happen very quickly, or they can be very slow. A lot of decisions in the Cold War were made over months of deliberation. In a tactical situation, when Americans are at risk, the president's got to make those decisions very, very quickly. I would argue it was the right decision. To this day, I haven't lost any sleep over the fact that I'm responsible for the death of Qasem Soleimani. Some of you may or may not be aware, the Iranians have actually tried to kill me. They're working on it. They're not good, but they're enthusiastic. So I'll be taking precautions for the rest of my life, but that's the cost of playing in Yankee Stadium. You're going to make those decisions. You're going to be in the big leagues, and that's the way it goes somehow.
So it's been a little over a year since the 7 October 2023 Hamas attacks against Israel. Since that time, sir, Israel's been at war with Hamas. Israel has been at war with Hezbollah. Iran has struck several times directly on Israel. The Houthis have been attacking merchant shipping and trying to attack U.S. Navy shipping in the Red Sea. The Central Command area has become, if not more dangerous, at least as dangerous during the 3 years that you were there. Set the theater for us, if you would. Just give us some insights into the kinds of conversations that your successor, General Kurilla, is having with the president now, with the SecDef, with his subordinate commanders, with his staff, with his allies and partners in the region. What's happening on his part right now?
So October of last year, as you know, the Houthis gained tactical strategic surprise against Israel, an attack that was very successful in its initial stages. They did that because they ruthlessly compartmented who they shared information with. They cut Iran out. They cut Lebanese Hezbollah out, and they had some initial success. Israelis have responded to that, and I'll come back maybe and talk about that a little bit later. But here's the thing, and this is the important thing. What did not happen was the Iranians didn't come in to support Hamas. That's very important. So hold that thought for a minute. Who else did not come in to support Hamas? Lebanese Hezbollah. So let me talk about Iran a little bit, Lebanese Hezbollah, and I'll come to the Houthis last because they're the most interesting of all of them. Iran is actually a country that's very predictable. They make decisions based off the prime objective for Iran is preservation of their revolutionary regime. Came to power in the late 1970s when they overthrew the Shah. They view the task of any revolutionary regime is to pass it to the next generation, not let it go deviationist, the way the Russian Revolution did and the French Revolution. So they're very aware of that. So that's the highest priority for Iran. Number 2 priority is destruction of Israel. Number 3 priority actually is ejection of the United States from the region. Priorities 2 and 3 are never going to threaten objective 1, which is preservation of the theocratic regime that is responsible for governing Iran. So Iran did not come in any meaningful way. Now they share the objectives of Hamas, destruction of the state of Israel, check, all about that. Good luck, fellas. And they've equipped and trained and given money to Hamas down through the years, but they did not come in any large way. So the other, Iran's biggest ally in the region is a group called Lebanese Hezbollah. They live up in Lebanon, which is actually one of the most beautiful countries in the world. Beirut's one of the most beautiful cities in the world. But Hezbollah, since the early 1980s, the Israelis bear some blame for Hezbollah coming into existence, I just have to say. Lebanese Hezbollah has been a parasite on the Lebanese state. They don't govern it completely, but they're a shadow government that provides many functions in Lebanon that the state of Lebanon can't actually provide. They've usurped authorities in the Lebanese armed forces. So they have about 100 to 120,000 rockets and missiles that can hit into Israel. That's a lot. That's a lot more than Iran has. Their leader, Hassan Nasrallah, until recently, was actually a pretty smart strategist. He would not go in against Israel unless he felt there was a possibility of strategic victory. Well, there's no possibility of strategic victory. I always assumed when I was a commander, and I haven't changed my mind now, 3 things would have to happen for him to come into the fight. Number 1, the Israelis would have to be so weak in the north because they were bogged down somewhere else that he had a favorable correlation of forces up there. Doesn't obtain. Second thing, the government of Israel would have to be so fractured that it would be hard for them to respond to a Hezbollah attack. Look, Israel, if you follow Israeli politics, they are fractured. No way are they fractured enough for this to happen. The third thing is he had to feel that Israel would be isolated enough in the international stage so that nobody would help them. Israel is more isolated than they've been. They still have vast resources available from the United States and other nations. So those 3 conditions didn't match. So Hassan Nasrallah wasn't going to come into the fight. But what happened, it got out of control a little bit, was he didn't launch the big rockets. And I can tell you, he could put 250 missiles an hour into downtown Tel Aviv. Now, the Israelis can intercept those missiles, most of them, not all of them, but Tel Aviv is a modern glass skyscraper city. It's going to cause a lot of casualties and a lot of devastation in Israel. He did not do that. Instead, what he did was to use lower-end rockets and missiles to attack northern settlement tier of kibbutzes and cities in northern Israel. As a result of that, the Israelis had to move about 80,000 people south. And that sort of I don't think Hassan Nasrallah knew that was going to happen when he started it, but it put additional pressure on the Israeli government. until we saw in the spring of this year, the Israelis probably facing a use it or lose it with these beepers that were distributed across everybody. All the LH chain of command had beepers because they believed it would prevent the Israelis from tracking the beeper because the throughput's much less. You get a code on it that tells you to go do something. You make a call from another location. Well, as we know, most of those were wired to explode. So what probably happened was LH uncovered that. The Israelis were afraid that their thousands of beepers would be uncovered, so they blew them up. Followed the next day with the handsets, and then because of pressure, Israel attacked Lebanese Hezbollah. And so I'll stick with Lebanese Hezbollah for a minute. As I talk to you today, Lebanese Hezbollah is leaderless. Rule is dead. The successor's dead. Successor's dead. I think they're successor number 3, a guy that might not be too happy about being the successor because the Israelis are going to come looking for him. I guarantee you, he's not using a beeper or a phone or anything else right now. So it's hard for him to pass orders. And the Israelis more quietly have gone after a lot of those rockets that I talked about because they're close to Israel and they've had great success in attriting them. Why is that important? Well, let's shift to Iran for a minute. Since April of this year, as you're all aware, Iran has attacked Israel twice. They did it on April the 13th in a massive ballistic missile, drone, and land attack cruise missile attack. Probably 300 total weapons, maybe more, pushing 200 ballistic missiles. And then they did it again about a month ago. So here's the thing to understand. Iran's ballistic missile fleet is probably 4,000, maybe 4,500 ballistic missiles. They got about 1,000 that can reach Tel Aviv, launching areas in western Iran. But they can't launch them all at once. They've got TELs, tractor erector launchers. For the sake of our discussion here tonight, let's say they got 200 of them. So that's all they can launch against Israel at any one time. So you got to bring the missile out of storage. You got to take it to the launch site. It's liquid fueled. You got to erect it. And once the stack is vertical, then you can fuel it. You can't fuel it, as you know, while it's laying down. So it takes them a while to do this. So the Iranians in April, no matter what you may have written or been told, that was a maximum effort by them. And it failed because 200 ballistic missiles is not going to penetrate Iron Dome, Iron Beam, David Sling, Arrow, Patriot, the multitude of systems that defend Israel. You can only get that kind of overwhelming capability if Lebanese Hezbollah comes in heavy from the north. And Lebanese Hezbollah is not capable of doing it. They didn't do it in April because they withheld. They didn't do it the last attack because they couldn't. So Iranians looked at the attack, assessed. In the meantime, the Israelis had an opportunity to strike back after that attack. And I'm very, very close to Israeli senior military leadership. I knew those guys pretty well. I was concerned they were going to strike back and go downtown Tehran, level 8 or 10 city blocks, which would have had effect of pushing away our administration from Israel and alienating their Arab neighbors. Instead, what they did was really pretty clever. They went and flew on what we call the Tehran-Esfahan corridor. Tehran's the capital, of course. Esfahan's another city in Iran. Between the two in that corridor is where the majority of the Iranian nuclear facilities are and a lot of their air defense. Israel went in there and operated in a way that the Iranians could not understand. They struck a couple of targets, and they were almost casually arrogant in the way they did it, leaving a signal that we can come back and do more. And what that had the effect of doing was befuddling the Iranians, and at the same time had the effect of not pushing away the Arab neighbors because the Arab neighbors helped to defend Israel from this attack. Additionally, it didn't push away the United States. Okay, so we fast forward. Attack on Lebanese Hezbollah occurs from Israel. The Iranians again think they're in a corner now. They know that Lebanese Hezbollah doesn't have much capability to help them, but they're continue to be embarrassed. They're embarrassed by whatever happened at the guest house in Tehran, where one of the Hamas senior leaders was killed. Again, the Israelis haven't claimed that. I think we can all assume it wasn't the Dutch that did it. So a lot of pressures on the Iranians. You got to do something or face the equally unpalatable choice of doing nothing. So in the last attack, what they decided to do was not use cruise missiles and drones, because the Iranian template actually was use the drones and the templates to take out the air defense radars. Because if you can do that, then the ballistic missile defense assets are useless because they can't go after the heavy killers, which are the big ballistic missiles coming in. So instead, they went with they salvo fired in 2 volleys, over 200, maybe pushing 300 in 2 salvos, spaced out over time, ballistic missiles into Israel. And again, I would say, just as a professional observer, that attack was unsuccessful. Look, a lot of missiles fell into Israel, not a lot, but as some of you know that are familiar with the way Aegis works, the way Patriot works, and the way the Israeli systems work, if the algorithm computes the missile's not going to hit a target, you let the missile fall. You don't waste an interceptor on it. It's going to fall in a field. It's going to fall on a deserted highway. If it's going to fall on a huge airfield and not on a aircraft parking ramp, a fuel farm, the ammo farm, or the hangars, you let it fall. So a lot of missiles hit Israel. I would not draw a lot of conclusions about Israeli ineffectiveness from the way that happened. So that attack occurred and brings us about to now, where the Israelis responded again, a very smart response. They went in and took out, Iran has 4 S-300 radars. The Russians gave them to them. They don't have many more. The ball is now in the Iranian court. They're as exposed as they have ever been. Their principal leverage against Israel in the region, Lebanese Hezbollah, is no longer a factor. It may be a factor in 60 or 90 days. Nothing's forever in this region. But for right now, they're not able to do anything. Iran is as weak as they've ever been. There's one group of people, though, that I said I'd talk about last. And of course, it's everybody's favorite, the Houthis. So the Houthis down in Yemen, the most radical of all the Iranian proxy groups, they seized power in Yemen in 2014. The Iranians actually didn't want them to seize power in 2014. They wanted to create a Lebanese Hezbollah situation in Yemen where you still had a government, but the Houthis were pulling the strings in order to give them cover. Well, the Houthis are pretty aggressive, so they overthrew the government. They fought a bloody stalemate against Saudi Arabia and a bloody stalemate against UAE over the past several years to keep a fraction of the country. But the Houthis are true believers. All the Iranian proxy groups, they're the ones that actually want to come in and help Hamas. Problem is, they're a long way from Israel. On the other hand, the Houthis are very good aeronautical engineers. It pains me to say that, but it's the truth. They get weapons from Iran, or they either come down in dhows all the way down off the coast of Oman, or they cut across the Strait of Hormuz. They're transloaded, they come down via surface. They take those weapons, they make them better, and they make some very good weapons. They're shade tree mechanics, but they're good shade tree mechanics in Yemen. They shot down my MQ-9s. They take an MQ-9 down about every 2 or 3 months. That gets old. That happens. But it's really, really good work for them. So they strike at Israel, can't have much success. But what they can do is they can close the Bab el-Mandeb. And that is what they have done. You close the Bab el-Mandeb, you're all aware of the geography of the region. You close the Bab el-Mandeb, you have closed the Suez Canal. So today, as I talk to you, the Suez Canal is closed. The only ships that are transiting the Bab el-Mandeb are Chinese flagships because the Chinese have cut a deal with it. And so Chinese bottoms are going through. Nobody else is really going through. They just restarted they struck some ships in the last 2 or 3 days. So the United States, as a matter of policy, we're a maritime nation. Nobody knows that better than you people sitting in this room in front of me right now. We cannot tolerate choke points being closed. It has nothing to do with defending Israel. It has everything to do with our requirement that the global commons be open for free commerce. So the national security objective is in both the national security strategy and the national defense strategy. We said we're going to reopen the Bab el-Mandeb, and we have failed to do that. It is a failure, not by the U.S. Navy, but a failure of policy. So the Houthis close it because they're able to fire short-range drones, close-range ballistic missiles, all kinds of other things against ships. And I've been through the BAM a number of times. It's a tight passage. You're really tight when you get down there. So the U.S. Navy doesn't like to operate in there because it's narrow waters. And an Aegis-class ship, a Burke-class destroyer, is not optimized to have most of its intercept area be over land. It's a blue water ship. So we've gone down there. We got destroyers down there that are playing catch. Destroyer's not meant to play catch. It's meant to pitch. You got an aircraft carrier down there that's not meant to catch either. It's designed to pitch and be offensive. I'll just be candid with you. I can say this because I'm now retired. The political will of the United States doesn't match our military capability down there. We have the ability to stop the Houthis from doing it. One of 2 ways. You either impose enough pain so they stop, or if that doesn't work, you go in and you make it not possible for them to actually do it. Military capability to do that is resident ships and platforms and other systems that are in the region right now, but we have failed to do that. So, and there's a lot of headlines out there, Houthis beat the U.S. Navy. That's not true. They haven't beat the U.S. Navy because the U.S. Navy has not been able to use the capabilities that it has to get after the Houthis or other elements of joint force that we could use to get after the Houthis. So of all the things we've done well in the region, and we have done some things very well, I'll say we have failed here. And it has ramifications far beyond the Bab el-Mandeb, because people who are interested in, say, the Strait of Taiwan are also drawing conclusions about U.S. will and willingness to actually do the things we say that we will do. So that's sort of where the region is right now. The last thing I'll say is, let me just talk about Gaza for a minute. Hamas has been defeated. Hamas has not been destroyed. There's a nonlinear jump from defeat to destruction. And I'm not sure that the Israelis are going to be able to get there, actually. Sinwar is gone. God bless them. No loss there. But they have not been able to actually stop the small level of activity that still goes on in the Gaza Strip. They're still fighting there. There's no end in sight. The hostages are not coming back. Tragic fact. I don't think there are a lot of them that are alive left. And those that are, there's no way in the world Hamas is going to turn over the one asymmetric advantage they still possess to the Israelis. There's just no way. Not in a million years is that going to happen. So again, I think tragically, many of these people are no longer with us. And those few that are going to be held until the very, very bitter end. And even then, I don't know that they're ever going to be turned over. So really, in terms of military operations, Israel has been very successful against Iran. They've been successful to a degree against Lebanese Hezbollah, but they have not yet stopped the attacks into northern Israel. That's all you need to look at. When those attacks stop, they will have been successful. It's a little more difficult to measure the success of the longer campaign, the campaign in Gaza. Long answer to a question,
Right.
but if you want it laid out.
Well, sir, you've given us a lot to think about. I want to open it up to the cadets now. So who's got a question out here? Please, there's 2 mics each aisle here. So please come down and ask your question.
So one thing before we begin questions.
Sure.
So I actually like questions. I don't know how you do it here. I've been at different organizations that do it different ways. You're not going to embarrass me with a question. I'm a 4-star general. There's no inner monologue of insufficiency or inadequacy here. So you're not going to ask me something that I'm going to be afraid to talk about.
Ask a hard question.
Whatever you got, I'm happy to talk about.
Bring it.
Good evening, General. First Class Kirby, regimental staff. Many of us look up to current and former military leaders as examples to model our leadership after. Who is a leader you looked up to throughout your military career, whose example you tried to follow, and why?
Question was,
Your role models, who
Yeah.
did you look up to?
so one thing I just to tell you, when I was a cadet at the Citadel and graduated in 1979, I was an indifferent cadet. I was an indifferent student. I graduated with a 2.3 GPA. Nobody, when I graduated. So
I resemble that.
So you know, if 2.0 weren't good enough, it wouldn't be 2.0. So at any rate, but what I did develop was a love of reading, and I did a lot of foundational reading, and I had the opportunity to go back to school a couple of times. So I look in the past for a lot. The people I look at, and some are ancient history, some are now. I'm a big fan of Sam Grant. General Grant came in, commanded U.S. forces in the U.S. Civil War. A guy that overcame some demons, some personal demons in order to do that. But a guy that knew how he related to the commander-in-chief, Abraham Lincoln. I've got it in our house, my wife and I in Tampa. We got a famous painting called The Peacemaker. You ought to look it up. It hangs in the White House, but it's a picture of a meeting that took place late March 1865 between Sherman, Grant, President Lincoln, and I want to say Admiral Porter. I think it was Admiral Porter. So some Navy steamboat sitting off City Point, Richmond. And what's happening is it's civil relations. Lincoln's come down to see his generals. He's given orders. You can tell if you look at it, Sherman appears to be lecturing the president, give him sort of a knife hand little thing. You can see Grant sort of looking back a little bit, but it's a great painting. And actually the Lincoln picture, the Lincoln in there, it was extracted from that painting and is his painting in the National Portrait Gallery. It's the official painting of Lincoln. So at any rate, Sam Grant. I'm a big fan of George Marshall, a guy who I think did a lot to organize the United States for victory in the Second World War. And again, he was totally selfless. Marshall often is seen as almost like a Christ figure. He had his own sets of flaws, but if he had wanted it, he could have commanded Overlord. All he had to do was say, I want Overlord. And FDR would have given him that command, but he would not do it. It's a remarkable act of selflessness. So now you go forward a little bit. One of my favorite Marine generals is a guy named O.P. Smith, retired Marine Lieutenant General. Probably no reason why you would know him here. But when people think of Marine fighting generals, they think of Chesty Puller. Probably some of you know Chesty Puller. Great fighting general from the Second World War. I'm not a big Chesty Puller fan particularly. In Korea, O.P. Smith commanded the 1st Marine Division. They were up north when the Chinese communists came in. He actually brought the division out, fighting from way up north near the Chosin Reservoir all the way down to the sea. And one of the most remarkable feats of arms, really, in the history of recorded warfare. And I like him because he was a low-key guy. Chesty Puller was his assistant division commander. If Chesty Puller had been in command, there would have been a lot more fighting, there would have been a lot more bravery, and none of those Marines would have got out. That's my theory. O.P. Smith was the right guy. He's lost to history unless you're somebody that's a Marine like me. You know, it's not a big thing. So look, you come forward a little bit. People that I knew when I was on active duty. Yeah. So when I was a company grade officer, I didn't know any generals. I had no idea. They were very far above me. You know, you don't meet generals in the Marine Corps till you're a field grade officer. You know, you begin to see them when you're a major a little bit, maybe a little bit when you're a captain. But I didn't. But as a major, you begin to see them. And I was very lucky that I had people that took an interest in me and were very helpful to me. And one of them was a guy named Buck Bedard. Again, no reason you should know his name. I was his executive assistant in the Pentagon on 9/11. He was the OPSO of the Marine Corps, the operations deputy of the Marine Corps. A good guy to me, sort of shaped my thinking. But you know, when you go down to people that you model yourself on, you know, you look at them and you see the way they make decisions. You see the way they handle people. Because in the Marine Corps, I think like in the Coast Guard, it's a people business. We don't have exotic equipment. We got people. That's what we bring. And that's very important to us. But one last guy I would say, and probably actually the most important person to me, is a guy named Field Marshal Slim, Bill Slim. He wrote a book called Defeat into Victory, which talks about his exploits in the Second World War. It's a beautiful book. I like it because he wrote it himself. And but he commanded in China, Burma, India, which is why nobody knows anything about it. The Japanese crushed him in 1941 and 42, drove his army all the way back to India. He came back and in 43, 44, 45, fought the Japanese to total, complete defeat. And there are two leadership things that he talked about that I've never forgotten. One is the secret of command, high command, which is what I probably know most about. Is you got to be able to impart energy with affection. So look, you got to be able to convince people they got to do things. Sometimes these things are going to put your lives at risk. And at the same time, if you can, you want to do it with a human touch. You want to do it. I know what I'm asking you to do. I understand that. Perhaps I've had to do it myself. Ideally, you would have had to do it yourself at some point. And so energy with affection. And I try to remember that. The other one is, so, you know, when you think of a military organization, we always think of a triangle. Commander's up top, next echelon, 3 or 4 people, blah, 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 all the way down to the snuffies that are actually doing the work at the very bottom, and lots of them. So what Slim talked about and what I tried to do when I was at CENTCOM particularly is I turned that around. When I was the CENTCOM commander, no shortage of people to help me do my job. The 14 lawyers I've talked about, brilliant operations people, brilliant planners, brilliant everything, the best logisticians in the world. So I had lots of help. But the fact of the matter is, the further you get away from the headquarters and the closer you get to where the enemy is, there are few people around. And eventually you get down to where there's a man and woman actually doing what I needed them to do, and there's nothing between them and the enemy except their shirt. So I always try to remember that. It is very lonely down there, and I've been there. I know that. I mean, you are going to be there pretty soon. You're going to know that. And that loneliness, even if you're on a crewed vessel or in a 2-man fighting position, a manned aircraft, tough places to be. I always try to remember that. A great question. Thanks for asking.
Over this side. There you go.
Good evening, General. My name is First Class Grace Yukaitis from Charlie Company. You mentioned that at one of the primary duties of the lawyers under your command was to ensure that you did not give or discharge an unlawful order. How were you able to pivot from an untenable idea to a lawful order that executed the mission?
Say that again.
Forgive me.
Pivot from,
Pivot from an untenable or like an initially illegal idea to something that could be executed.
so look, so I never, an unlawful order would have been very clear to me. I'll give you an example of an unlawful order. Just at one point, President Trump said we're going to strike 52 World Heritage sites in Iran. He said that would have been an unlawful order, and I would not have been able to execute that order. So that actually never happened. He just said we're going to do it, but we never did it. That would have, so I would have known. That would have been pretty clear. I've been talking to those 14 lawyers. They would have been earning their pay during that period of time. But I also got orders I didn't agree with. So here's the thing, and this is you pick it up much earlier in life and before you're a four-star commander. If you're going to be in charge, you can't just be can't just be somebody that conducts heat. You've got to absorb the heat. So it was always, whenever I was in command, I made a point, but the world doesn't exist above me. If I tell you to do something because I'm telling you to do it, I might think it's not a good idea. If you're sending people into harm's way, the last thing you want to do is say, hey, gather around, fellas. This really sucks, but we're going to have to do it. You owe them better than that. So the phrase transactional leadership has gotten a bad rap. But when I was a commander, I was a transactional leader. Because here's what I would do. I'm in command. I'm going to give you the best possible plan. Make sure you got the best equipment. To give it the best thought I got. I'm going to give you a way to get in and get out if we can do it. I can't promise you that you're going to get in and get out because that's the nature of the beast. But I'm going to give you the best possible opportunity to do this and to come back, which is what I owe the people that work for me. What I expect from them is I expect them to execute those orders. So for me, that's transactional. But you have to, when it comes time to give orders, and it's always early in the morning or late at night. It's never under optimum conditions. It's in my business, it's always raining on you, it seems like, and you're giving it under conditions when you may not feel the best, you're sleepy, you're tired, but people depend on you then. And you wanted to be there, now you're there. You got to own it. And that worked for me from the time I was an 03 as a battalion commander, a MU commander. I got a lot of orders I didn't like. But the big orders you don't like, you get when you're a force. Those are the big orders you get that you don't. And I was very lucky that I never got an illegal order. I got orders that I didn't agree with the decision to leave Afghanistan. I thought that was a mistake. I had the opportunity to say that to the president. He made a decision. Once he makes a decision, I'm going to execute his orders to the very best of my ability. That get to your question.
It did. Thank you, General.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. I think we have time for two more questions. So one over here, and then we'll go over here. So sure.
General Second Class Will Spot at Echo Company. Thank you for coming out tonight. You briefly mentioned a lack of U.S. political will to act on Iranian proxy groups in the Middle East. I wanted to apply this in the Indo-Pacific. Do you believe that there is currently political will to act should a conflict erupt in the Pacific? If there is a lack of will to act here, how will this affect relationships with our partners in the region?
Sure. So the great question. First of all. So, look, China's a long-term problem for the United States. The problems I'm discussing, the Middle East, short-term problems. And everything I've said about the Middle East, that's not existential to the United States. But sometimes with the excitement of what's going on, we forget that. The existential threats to the United States are China and Russia. Russia's more of an acute threat right now, but China is, I agree, that China is the long-term threat to the United States. But I would tell you, the one advantage that the United States brings is our alliance structure. At U.S. Central Command, there were 39 nations that worked with us to some degree. 39 officers and staffs that were headquartered, that worked down there at McKenzie. NATO is the most successful defensive alliance really in the history of warfare. So the United States always fights and functions better when we're in an alliance structure. We have an alliance structure in the Western Pacific, kind of has nothing. They don't have that. You know, I'm aware of China's doing all around the world. I'm aware of all that, but they don't have Australia. They don't have Japan. They don't have the Philippines. They don't have the relationships we have with those. That is unique. And I would argue, so the problem with going to war with allies is they get a vote. And, you know, so Churchill once said, you know, there's nothing worse than fighting with allies except fighting with allies. That's very true. I am an internationalist in my, because if you're going to be a commander CENTCOM, your AORs on the other side of the world, none of it's on United States soil. So you have to understand the relationship we have with others. So to go back, so a little bit of groundwork for your answer your question. Look, I think that we have advantages in the Indo-Pacific against China. Those advantages principally are those nations that will be with us should that happen. That requires constant attention. Constant attention. Everybody wants to have a relationship with the United States. Our equipment's the best. The joint force is the best. There are a lot of reasons, both larger and smaller, why nations want that. But that is, I believe that is a capability. That is something that we can use against China.
Thank you, General.
Sure.
Last question.
Good evening, General. Good evening, Captain. 4th Class Dixon, Bravo Company. Go Bulls. My question for you is, you mentioned earlier that there were times when you were advising that they took your advice and times that they didn't. Which time that they didn't take your advice was the biggest learning experience for you?
Sure. So, great question. You know, time I really disappointed they didn't take my advice was over Afghanistan. I felt very strongly that and I and my commander on the ground, I had a 4-star general that worked for me on the ground in Afghanistan, a great American named Scott Miller. We felt that there was a path to stay in Afghanistan, 2,500 U.S. forces. We had 5,000 NATO troops that would have stayed. Many people don't realize that. NATO was more eager to stay than the United States. So that was I don't know if it was a learning experience. I would tell you that it was a bitter disappointment. But, you know, but the thing is, you get your opportunity, you're talking to the president, and the president never makes a decision in a room where you're giving advice like this. No president does. They want to go away, be in a smaller room with a smaller group of people, and then make the decision. So I knew, I had no idea what way President Biden was going to come down on that decision when I gave that advice. I think that was I don't know if it was a learning experience. I was very disappointed. I'll tell you just 2 other opportunities. When this whole thing with Iran started in 2019, I just come into the command. I taken command in April of 2019. This is late May. The Iranians start acting up and doing a variety of things. And at that point, I'm calling for more forces. I want a carrier. I want a Marine Expeditionary Unit in there. I want a couple more fighter squadrons. I want Patriots. Of course, service chiefs, my good friends, fighting me to the death on this. And so the mistake I made, and it was a mistake I talk a little bit about in the book. I should have fought. This sounds like bureaucracy, but it's not. I should have fought to have it become a named operation, like Operation Enduring Freedom, OEF. Because once you do that, the money gets cut on. I didn't do that. It was a mistake. I learned from that. I never repeated that mistake again. Now I'm not talking to the president. I'm talking to the secretary there. That's below the president's level. But I'm talking to the secretary on decisions. So those are just a couple decisions that stick out at me. Look, when I was younger, one thing I did learn when I was a lieutenant colonel in 2005, I was a pretty aggressive, hard-nosed infantry battalion commander. That's what the Marine Corps wants in its infantry battalion commanders. But I learned over time that a couple of things. You should never, because I did it and I regret it, you never burn bridges over issues. Because unfailingly, if I really had a big drop down, drag out fight with somebody over matter, then the next day I'd need their help on something. And, you know, hopefully you learned that younger than I did. It took me a while to learn that. I've learned it now. But you know, when you're talking to people, you have to keep those lines open. It's very important to do that, particularly laterally. You want to keep it open. And the last thing would be, just as you make decisions, American men and women are not going to fight for you unless they know why they're doing it. The U.S. military and the U.S. Coast Guard and all of us, we're not a bunch of automatons that march off to war and clock set. People that think that have no idea of the diversity that's in this group of people sitting in front of me, diversity of thought, diversity of opinion. You can't sell people to do it just because you're going to tell them we're going to do it. You've got to explain why we're going to do it. I think that's what makes the United States Joint Force uniquely capable around the world, because people that do it have had it explained to them. And successful commanders are going to take the time to do that. Great question. Thank you.
While my boss comes to the stage, I want to say thanks to the cadets of the U.S. Coast Guard Academy for your great questions. Thank you, General, for sharing your insights with us. This is a great conversation.
Thanks. I enjoyed being here.
Boss, Admiral Spicer.
Good evening, everyone. I don't know if you know, but this conference we've done for 10 years in partnership between the U.S. Naval Institute, which I have the honor of running, and the Coast Guard Academy. So I want to thank Admiral Johnston for being a great partner to put things like this on. And it's really for you. I want to thank, probably more than anyone, General McKenzie, for spending some time with you. I think you got your money's worth out of General McKenzie. So another round of applause for him, please. Thanks, General McKenzie. We can't do this without sponsorship and support. So we get our sponsorship from the William M. Wood Foundation. So thanks to them. And the message that I would leave with you from my position at the Naval Institute, some of you are familiar with it. We produce magazines, we publish books. So you probably saw a bunch of proceedings magazines out there as you walked in tonight. You're going to see them as you roll out. I would encourage you to invest in yourselves, to read, think, speak, and write. And we're offering you an opportunity to do that, and it's totally free. I know I sound like I'm selling used cars here. I'm not. The reason that we can offer memberships to students like you is because we have donors that are willing to foot the bill for your membership. So in this case, example is Admiral Thad Allen says, I'm going to sponsor 2 companies to be members of the Naval Institute. So again, the title says Naval Institute, but it's really about Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard. And I'll leave you with one thought as well. We had a reception before we came over here where we delivered some awards to Coast Guardsmen who had won the essay contest. What I shared with the group over there is we put on several essay contests a year. One of which is the Leadership Essay Contest, which is open to Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard. And when we judge these essays that people submit, we do it completely in the blind. So we don't know if it was General McKenzie who submitted an essay, or it was Bill Hamlet or Seaman Beeman that submitted an essay. We scrub the name, we read the essay, and then we pick first, second, and third. You will be very proud, you should be very proud to know the Leadership Essay Contest open to all Navy, Marines, Coast Guards. Coast Guard took first, second, and third place. So hats off to you. Thanks again. Appreciate your support.
General McKenzie and Captain Hamlet, thank you for your generous time this evening. On behalf of the Academy community, please accept this gift as a small token of our
It's stuck.
Nicely done.
Will the audience please rise for the departure of the official party? Dismissed. Have a good night, everybody.